Welcome to Lifestyle by Design, helping you solve everyday challenges. I'm Karen Jacobs, a professor at Boston University, an occupational therapist, and a Brookline Rotarian. And here's my co-host.
Hi, and I'm Andrea Calso, Community Relations here at Brookline Interactive Group. Today we have a very interesting episode for you. We're joined by two experts, Grainne O'Leary, who's a funeral director at Stanetsky Memorial Chapels in Brookline, and Laura Days, who's an estate planning attorney at Israel Van Kooy Days here in Brookline. And they're going to be speaking with us about end-of-life planning, which we think is a very interesting conversation to have, both because it's something we don't talk about a lot, so we want to break down some of those barriers, and there's also, because of that, a lot of information we don't know, and we're going to find out.
Yeah, and you know, I think, Andrea, for us, both of it, it's a topic that we've talked about quite a bit, particularly because I personally didn't know anything about it. And I recently lost my dad in November, and I remember my father having nothing written out, and in passing, before he knew he was passing away, he said, might as well cremate me and throw me in the water. And I'm like, what? I needed to have a conversation with him, and I think a lot of families don't have those conversations. So help us. How do you begin? You know, what should people do?
Sure, absolutely. You know, this happens quite frequently. You know, in general, people don't like to think about the end of their lives, and it's just kind of brushed off to the side. What I do in particular is advanced planning with families, and what I do is, you know, I sit down with families in advance and kind of just go over things when things are basically, you know, non-emotional. You know, I go over all of the options and what goes into funeral planning and things of that nature. So I can totally understand the situation that you were in, because I do see that frequently. A lot of times people don't think about it, and then something happens, and then they come in and they're completely ill-prepared. As you said, they have no idea what funeral planning is all about, what goes into it, you know, for your dad, well, what does dad really want? Things like that. So a lot more frequently now, people are coming in, you know, say parents, grandparents, even a lot of younger people, and they put their wishes down. So that way, you know, when something does occur, everything has been taken care of. The family doesn't have to worry about, you know, what would mom or dad want. As you said, you know, your father said, oh, I want to be cremated, and you know, was that really his wishes, or was that just something that he said to you? So a lot more families are starting to set things up in advance. That way, it's a lot easier for the family that's left to take care of it. It's already planned, it's already set, and all that needs to happen is that a phone call to the funeral home, and the funeral directors, such as myself, you know, we're trained and we're experts on what goes into it. We help families through things. We help families in advance, during the time, and even we do some aftercare with families as well.
Oh, that's great. And one thing I learned from you before we got on the show was people write in their wills what they want for their funeral. And could you share with us, because it was like an aha moment for both of us. We're like, oh my goodness, we never even thought of that.
Sure. A lot of times, you know, people think, you know, oh, I have my will, this is my wishes, and things of that nature, and everything's all set. You know, which is fine, you know, and that's absolutely a great thing to do. But when it comes to funeral plans, a lot of times what people don't realize is that the funeral itself is usually over before the will is read. So the family then at that, you know, during the funeral arrangements is panicking, trying to figure out, you know, what would my loved one want for services. They pick, you know, based on what their thoughts are, and then the will is read, and it could be a oh no moment, or whatever you may want to call it. Right. But that's just something that people just are unaware of.
Yes.
You know?
We were shocked.
we were absolutely shocked.
Sure.
So Laura, what
actually,
as an attorney.
And I actually advise my clients on that same thing, because usually by the time people get around to finding the will and looking at it, it's too late. One of the documents I will prepare for clients who have strong feelings about what they want for a funeral or memorial service is called a directive as to remains. And this document I prepare usually has, it could be something as basic as naming somebody who they want to make all decisions. It could be something as complicated as saying, I would like to be cremated, and I want my ashes spread here and there and everywhere. But at the very least, I usually put somebody in charge. And I don't generally prepare these, unless a client asks me to. I don't generally prepare these for clients who have talked about this with their family. This is usually something that comes up most frequently for a client who doesn't have a close relative or isn't married or is relying on a friend to make these decisions and to make these arrangements for them.
And what is it called one more time?
Directive as to remains.
Directive as to remains. So for someone who has someone, is there any other documents that are drawn up or wishes that are written down?
You could certainly do a directive as to remains and inform your family, your spouse, as to what your actual wishes are. My understanding is that the law grants a next of kin right to make funeral arrangements.
Correct.
And so that's why it's an important thing for people who don't have a next of kin or don't want their next of kin to make their decisions. Oh. That being said, I think it's an important thing that people need to talk about with their families. I'm a big fan of the Thanksgiving speech, and you don't necessarily have to do this at Thanksgiving dinner, but that's when the entire family is around. You have everybody gathered around the table. You have witnesses.
Yes.
So what a great time to sit down and talk about what your wishes are for end of life planning, for things like hospice and how you want to be treated towards your final illness, and then for your funeral as well.
Yeah, and I remember that you had said this, we were just casually talking, you said, I want people to talk about death more. And of course I was like, what are you talking about? It's exactly that.
It's so true, and I was thinking back, when would we have discussed it? It wasn't a class in kindergarten, it wasn't a class in elementary school or junior high or high school, and perhaps in college you might have gotten an elective on death and dying. But unless you're a family that this is something you talk about, we are so ill prepared for a major happening in every single person's life. So how do we demystify that to have people talk about it more? We're hoping people hearing the show will be able to do that. But what else do you think we could do?
Other icebreakers at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Go.
Icebreaker, yes.
Well, it's an icebreaker. There are people that actually have death dinners that sit around and schedule an actual dinner party with family and friends, not necessarily around a major holiday, to kind of talk about this thing and take away that culture. Well, we have a cultural taboo about talking about death. And there are people that will set out to specifically break that taboo, and it's very uncomfortable to start off with if it's something that you're not comfortable doing. But I don't know if you've heard about these or seen this.
I haven't heard about that, but one thing that we do actually is we go out into the community and we offer seminars, free seminars for people, and basically just kind of, break that ice, give some information about what is involved, and just to kind of get people thinking about it.
So the pre-planning.
A pre-planning type of, or just in general, about what goes into different things, because people don't think about it. You don't know until you're hit with it.
Do you think that, and maybe Laura, this might be something that you might see in both of you, do you find that someone starts thinking about this when they turn a certain age, or maybe they were diagnosed with, cancer or something terminal, or are people starting to look at it when they're, healthy and young?
I always encourage people to start thinking about that sort of thing, usually when they get married and when they have a child, because these are major life decisions that you need to start thinking about. When you have, people think about estate planning when they have an estate to protect or family to protect. And my job is to help encourage them to think about that entire process while they're thinking about, okay, we need to name a guardian for our child. Okay, let's talk about naming a healthcare proxy. Let's talk about doing a living will and talking about what you want for funeral wishes, things like that. I think for a lot of people, they start thinking about what they want when they see something happen to a close one. So their parent dies, or they have a close friend who gets a diagnosis or passes away, and that's oftentimes a big trigger for people. They realize, hey, wait a minute, this could happen to me, or I saw what happened to my mom and I don't want to be in that same position, or I saw this happen to a friend and I want to make sure that my wishes are known.
Well, that happened to me, and I was telling you about that because it was so challenging to plan my dad's funeral because my mom couldn't do it because she has dementia. As soon as everything was completed, I went back to my living will, wrote everything out, you know, for my kids, what to do, what my wishes were, you know, go to Social Security first, you know, make sure you get enough death certificates. But then I told my kids, and some of them were like, "Oh, Mom, that's kind of, you know,
morbid,
morbid to do." But I said, you know, I don't want you to experience the same thing that I experienced. So for me, it felt being really responsible.
It's a teaching moment, even for adult children.
Absolutely.
Well, absolutely.
It sure is.
Among my peers, this is not a conversation we have. At most, thank God, we're only just maybe losing our grandparents. Not any of us have to think about even losing a parent yet, unless it's unexpected. So the only times I have these conversations are with the grandparents at the table, usually at a family dinner at some point. Someone says, "Oh, and when I go, I want you to have this, and I don't want you to do that." But then that's it. I'm not as yet been involved in a decision-making process, so it'd be a long time before it ever happened. Kind of what Karen said before, you don't talk about it even as an adult.
No, it's hard. It's hard work. You know, I'm going to shift to something that goes hand in hand with this. Living wills. I think a lot of people don't understand that, and maybe you could help, you know, our viewers understand what a living will is versus having a will.
Sure. So a last will and testament, which is the will we always hear about, is basically a document that says who gets your stuff when you pass away. It usually nominates an executor, who in Massachusetts now we call a personal representative, but it's a person who represents the estate, and their job is to make sure that all the formalities you talked about, like going to Social Security, getting enough death certificates, filing paperwork with the probate court. They basically clean up your estate and make sure everything gets passed on to those people that you've named in your will who get your stuff when you die. And then if you have minor children, you should probably also name a guardian for those children in case something happens to you, so that the court has a record of who you would like to raise your kids if something happens to you. A living will, on the other hand, is a document that basically lays out what your wishes are in case you are ever in a permanent coma, a persistent vegetative state, or another condition that's characterized by a diminished quality of life, no hope of recovery, and the inability to communicate your wishes at that time. There's no living will statute in Massachusetts. So a lot of states have a statute that says if you execute a living will that says these various things, they must be honored in such and such a fashion. Massachusetts doesn't have that, but I still encourage clients to prepare living wills for two reasons. Number one, when clients feel strongly about having feeding tubes disconnected, respirators disconnected, things like that, I think that it's good for them to have those wishes in writing, and I always have them witnessed by two witnesses, so that in a case where the family members are hesitant to do this or the family members don't want to do that, you actually have something signed by the person in writing with two witnesses saying, yes, this is actually what I want. The second reason I do it for people is because they might not necessarily disagree with what their parents want to do, or what the healthcare proxy might not necessarily disagree with the wishes of the person who's filled out a living will, but I think that it gives them a certain sense of relievance of guilt. So I get so many clients who come to me and say, oh, I want to be disconnected, pull the plug, I don't want to be kept alive under those circumstances. But if you turn around and ask them, could you pull the plug on your mom? Most of them say, I don't think I could do that. And I think that if they have something in writing that mom signed that says, yes, I don't want to live like this, suddenly that kind of makes them feel as though they're fulfilling somebody's wishes, as opposed to having to make a difficult decision about how to handle their parents' healthcare situation in that case.
So it's really important to do.
If you feel strongly about being not being connected to machines under that kind of a diminished quality of life situation, I think it's vital to have a living will.
Is that a do not resuscitate?
It's completely different.
Oh, great. So maybe you can explain the difference then.
So do not resuscitate is it's a medical order basically, and I think, I'm not 100% positive on this, but I think that you actually have to get your doctor to sign off on it, or at least you have to have, it's something that's done in conjunction with your primary care physician's office. And that's the kind of thing where you get a card that you can put up on your refrigerator, you might have a bracelet or some other notification. But in an emergency situation, EMTs are are required to stabilize you. And if they see that there's a DNR and they come to your house and you're having a stroke, they can step back and they don't have to perform those emergency medical services. A living will is more on the idea that you want them to perform those initial emergency services and see if they can revive you. Then once you're in that status where you're not recuperating, the doctors say, there's really nothing that we think we can do here. At that point, that's when people decide to disconnect. But they actually connected you to start off with, generally speaking. And so that's really the big difference. Most people who get a DNR are usually older or have a terminal medical condition. My grandfather had one of those. I remember he was in his mid to late 90s. And I think the concern was that if he had a major medical incident like a heart attack or a stroke, it was just going to prolong the inevitable for him to be resuscitated, and he'd end up in a hospital for a long time. And I think they wanted to avoid that. So
that was really informative because I got them confused myself. Now I want to shift to something that I think a lot of people might be interested in knowing too: cremation. Sure. Can you tell? It seems like to me when I have conversations with people that being cremated is on the rise. Is that happening, and can you tell us a little bit about that too?
Sure. I mean, it's definitely something that is on the rise. It's really something that's more of a personal preference. Okay. Some people feel strongly about the fact that they don't want to be, buried in the ground. Some people feel that it's less expensive, things of that nature. So basically it's, kind of a personal preference thing. There's a lot more, I don't want to say there's a lot more restrictions or anything on that, but there's different procedures, a lot more forms and things that would need to be signed because obviously it's irreversible. There is a law that if someone does want to be cremated, I know we talked about it a little bit earlier about the 48 hours and things like that, and the medical examiner must sign off. Some people feel like cemeteries are filling up as well, and they don't want to be, to try and save space. Some people want it because they want their family to have their remains. They want their remains maybe to be scattered. So basically, as I've already said, it's kind of a personal preference, what you're more comfortable with. Sometimes there's religious aspects to it where certain cultures are, they don't favor it. So people tend not to do it, but as time goes on, things are changing, and cremation is definitely on the rise. So
would you then, if those were your wishes, would you put that into the living will?
I would put that in the directive as to remains.
Okay, that's where it would go. Okay.
And sorry to cut you off. And we also have forms as well. We can have people, if they want cremation themselves, that they can sign off on it. At the time of death, there would be other signatures needed by next of kin as well.
So are you finding that more and more people are doing this pre-planning?
Absolutely.
They are. Okay, so
absolutely.
The word's out there that, to do it ahead of time, the living will, is that on an increase too? Do you think people wanting living wills?
To be honest with you, that's one of the most common things people call, when they call it to schedule estate planning, they talk about doing a will, they want to nominate a guardian, and I get a lot of people who talk about doing a living will. And I haven't figured out fully if they are confusing the last will and testament with the living will, or if they really want that. But I think, for me, I encourage everyone to do everything, to do a healthcare proxy, a power of attorney, and a living will when you do a will. So I don't necessarily see it on the rise, because from my practice, I encourage my clients to do everything.
Right. You mentioned healthcare proxy, and you've mentioned it before, so again, maybe we could dig a little bit into that and explain what that is.
So Massachusetts has a statute that says that you are allowed to nominate a person, a healthcare agent, to make medical decisions on your behalf if you're unable to communicate your wishes, and you may designate an alternate healthcare agent if the first person is not available. These are really important documents because the healthcare proxy and a living will and a power of attorney take effect while you're still alive, but you're unable to actually communicate your wishes. The importance of having a healthcare proxy is that if something does happen to you and you are over the age of 18, obviously your parents can't make these decisions for you, and these powers are not automatically conferred on a spouse. So your family members, if someone needs to make decisions on your behalf, like for medical treatment, your family members have to go to court and have a guardianship set up. So a healthcare proxy actually keeps your family out of court and saves time and money.
Wow.
And arguing.
And arguing, because
sure
you're very clearly designated, this is the person who's authorized to make decisions.
Right. And so I'm wondering then, you know, obviously you have these conversations every day. You must have a lot of good people skills to talk about delicate subjects. So I'm wondering what that's like, and especially going back to what we were talking about earlier, when you have maybe as a family that dinner table conversation, you know, what's a good way to guide someone if they don't know, you know, what they want? How do you help someone that really, they know they want to do something, but they don't know what they want? You know, you've expressed being lost. Yeah, where do you start? How do you open that conversation with them?
Basically, how I start things off is, you know, I'll sit down with the family, you know, just kind of a relaxed setting like we have now, and just kind of talk to them about, you know, what are their thoughts, what's important to them, what's important to their family, and just kind of get a basic idea. Because there's so many options and different things, and I'm not going to, you know, sit down and say, this is what you need to do. You need to do this, 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 and this, because everything is personal. Right. You know, every service is different. Every service is unique to what the family wants and feels strongly about. So I try to just kind of get to know the family, you know, what they're, basically if they have any customs, family customs, religious customs, anything that's special to whoever they're making the plans for, things like that. So just kind of almost make it a calm environment for people to just talk about it, because it is a difficult subject. And then usually people really kind of open up to that and they start thinking about, oh, you know, this is something that mom is important to mom or dad, or this is something that's important to me. And we just kind of write things down. You know, there's no like obligation or anything like that. You know, it's just basically writing things down. I would then go over with them, you know, what the different options are, and what do you think about this and that, and just kind of, you know, basically educating families, talking to them, getting to know them a little bit, what their personal preferences are, educating them on the different options, and then we just work together and put together a plan for them.
Great. And you had actually said that if people who watch the show have questions, that you'd be very willing to have them contact you as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's what I do, is basically, you know, people sometimes get afraid. They may not want to come to the chapel. I can come to them. I've met families out, you know, different places in public, because, you know, it's just that topic that's uncomfortable. So absolutely, and you know, as I said, there's no obligation. People just sit down. We just have like a very relaxed conversation about things, and
that's great.
To put things together. So absolutely, anyone that would want to contact me, just to even ask questions, or it's definitely okay.
And Laura, you know, what both of you do go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I know.
Right. And Laura, you have the same offer, but you also teach a class at Brookline Adult Ed, right?
I teach an estate planning course at Brookline Adult Ed. We try to offer it at least 2 semesters out of the year. I know that we're going to have it again on, I think it's Wednesday nights, the first 2 weeks in November of this coming school year. We've already set up the catalog, and I think that's going to print shortly.
That's great. So another resource for people, because, you know, I remember I sat down and I Googled information, and that probably wasn't the best way. Maybe it was a good way to start, but maybe not getting. I may not have gotten really accurate information. So between the two of you.
I think maybe to close, we've talked a lot about pre-planning. So maybe some words of either comfort, wisdom, advice for maybe someone who, maybe like yourself, comes into this very suddenly and has to make decisions and find answers very quickly. What's something we can leave our viewers with there?
Sort of a take-home message for us.
Whatever you can do to break the taboo, the more that you can do to talk to your family about what your wishes are, and set up an estate plan, set up a plan for what you want for your funeral, I think is really the best thing you can do.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Laura, Grainne, thank you so much for coming. This has been very informative.
It has been.
And if you want to see more information, we'll be sharing that. You can watch this rebroadcast on Big TV. You can find the schedule for that at brooklineinteractive.org. You'll also find more information about our show and other episodes both at brooklineinteractive.org and on Karen's blog. And we will see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.